I've been a therapist for nearly a decade, and as both a man who has attended therapy and who provides therapy for men, mental health and masculinity was quite an interesting topic to put my thoughts together on. And I have come up with this idea that therapy for men exists on a spectrum that we'll call the masculinity mindset to mental health spectrum. And I think I need to work on that one. At one end of the spectrum are men who see therapy as conversational, casual, insightful, not really a big deal. But there's no guarantee that when I start working with a new male client, that they are going to feel like that. Because for a large percentage of men, they are at the other end of the spectrum. For gents at this end, therapy feels like stepping into enemy territory. They are forced to talk about their deepest, darkest struggles and their most intimate feelings with a total stranger. And I was definitely in that zone the first time I went to therapy. And now, thanks to, I guess, my training and perhaps more experience, I'm at the other end. So I know it is possible to feel more relaxed and confident in therapy and move up this spectrum. But why is therapy for men harder for some and not others? In this video, I want to explore how therapy for men, mental health and masculinity and this spectrum relate to the 4 rules of masculinity that most men aren't even aware of, but are often forced to obey. I'm going to include some thoughts on how to move up this spectrum that will help therapists and men who are thinking about therapy or worried about their mental health. But in order to really understand what the male mindset to mental health spectrum is actually about, we have to start thinking about the complexity of what masculinity is and what it means to male clients and male identified clients, because to varying degrees, it impacts everything about therapy for men. So what does it mean to be a man? Well, that is just a completely obnoxious question, and I hope there is not an actual definition because it's so deeply personal. I think it is up to us as individuals to come up with our own definition. Because if I step outside my office right now, I'll be standing on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood. Music will be pulsing from the local clubs, go-go boys gyrating on stages and rainbow flags everywhere. Asking a man in West Hollywood what it means to be a man will get me one answer. But if I drive an hour south and ask a Marine in Camp Pendleton what it means to be a man, well, I'll hear a completely different answer. Our unique and personal understanding of what being a man is or what masculinity is comes from and is shaped by culture, family, society, and perhaps our own expectations and experiences. And at the same time, there is a deeply understood, traditional, often toxic view of masculinity that gets shared through culture and society. It's characterized by toughness, independence, emotional stoicism, and sometimes aggression. I mean, there is a reason that the Wolverine movies are so popular. Out of all of the comic book characters, that's the one that seems to be the most that is connecting with men right now. There's something about that rugged, solo, powerful, strong man that seems to exemplify what masculinity is to a lot of people. And in previous generations, maybe that was John Wayne or James Bond. What I mean is society is reinforcing these traditional traits associated with masculinity, which means for any individual growing up in this world, the idea of masculinity is reinforced from media, from childhood peers, and perhaps older generations of men. So gents, if you're not aware of it, the pressure to live up to or into these ideals has been somewhere in the back of your psyche since day one. Let's break masculinity down into these 4 unwritten and totally unofficial rules. These rules are so ingrained and implicit that most men don't even question them or feel that they need to live up to them or are living up to them. So the rules are: bring home the bacon, be the mountain, don't think pink, and guns are great. But before I break these down for you, I'm going to put a link below for you to download the handout that goes with this. And if you're enjoying this or finding it useful, please do me a favor and share this video with someone who you think might like it or someone who could benefit from it. And you could also hit subscribe or like. Those little things let me know that you want more of these videos. I want to add a caveat that I suspect, hope, and think that these rules are more applicable to men over 30 maybe or 35 than an 18-year-old. We've been working really hard as a professional collective to raise mental health awareness around masculine stereotypes. So hopefully this isn't quite so prevalent in future generations. But again, These ideas are all reinforced from multiple angles. So even if parents are super liberal and insistent that they're not enforcing traditional gender roles, we just don't live in a bubble. The first rule is bring home the bacon. Men provide for their family, even if it means missing kids' baseball games and forgetting wedding anniversaries. I fully support a client who wants to get a second job to pay off debt, to save up for a deposit on a house, or anything that is taking action to get closer to their goals, financial or personal. And at the same time, I have a lot of clients talk about the incredible financial pressure they're under to support their family. That pressure to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs is directly impacting their physical and emotional well-being. I can also think of numerous male clients who are married or are in a long-term relationship, and they've taken on the role of being the breadwinner for the family. And they either earn more than their partner or are the only ones in the family making money. And that could be for a million different reasons, and there's absolutely no judgment or right or wrong way to do this. But in these cases that I'm thinking of, it's an imbalance in a relationship that is causing some distress. We all fall into roles in our families and relationships. So I might be in the role of the one who takes the dog for a walk in the morning, or the one who always waters the plants. If I like walking the dog in the morning and I like watering the plants, everything's fine. I might not even be aware that I'm in a role, I just do it. But when you get stuck in a role that you don't want, or feel that you're stuck in a role that you can't change, then resentment builds and things get more tense. So sometimes therapy is about pointing out the roles that our clients are in and making sure if they're okay with it, or perhaps exploring how they can go about changing it. The other aspect of bring home the bacon that impacts therapy is to do with the implicit demand it places on men to be self-sufficient. So this rule is subtly suggesting that men have to figure everything out on their own. Self-sufficiency is the antithesis of seeking help from a therapist. So some men who are leaning into this rule of masculinity are much less likely to seek therapy in the first place. And instead, they might be more likely to seek solutions to emotional problems that don't require another person, and that usually takes the form of self-medication. So this rule of masculinity is part of what is going on when men try and alleviate their emotional distress through substances, through addictive behaviors like pornography or compulsive buying, or just the funneling of emotions into anger and acting out. Rule number 2 is be the mountain. Boys who show weakness become men who are left behind. So don't show weakness, don't show fear, don't show any feelings. So I'll give you an example of what this looks like in therapy with a fictitious client. Is a composite client, which means it's based on lots of different experiences. So there's no one recognizable person here. And we'll call him Jimmy. And Jimmy came to see me because he just got dumped. We talked about that in the first session, but in the second or third session, he told me more about himself. And I found out that his mother had died. He'd started a new company, he'd moved house, and he was in a lawsuit with his old company. All of that had happened in the past few months prior to him coming to see me in treatment. I reflected all of this back to him and said something like, "How are you still standing?" I don't know if it was the sincerity of the question or the question itself, but I could tell he really hadn't considered the cumulative effect of all of the things that had been going on, because he'd been living by this rule of masculinity, of being the mountain, that states he had to be the tough one, to be strong, to be unshakable and solid no matter what. This rule of masculinity was telling him to suck it up and soldier on until this relationship ended. And then he started having symptoms of anxiety. He had no real concept that it was accumulation of all of the things that had been going on. This rule is also behind the belief that talking doesn't help. And if you have to tell someone your issues, you're being weak. Well, unfortunately, psychology as a field has about a century of studying people that confirms that this is officially a load of bollocks, right? It's just wrong. But I do understand why that thought still persists in men, because many men learned as kids that expressing their emotions leads to feeling worse, either because those feelings weren't validated, or it leads to feeling worse because sharing emotions led to feelings of shame or humiliation because somebody made fun of that little boy for daring to express a feeling. So let's imagine your first experiences of sharing that you felt sad or scared to a parent, and they were met with a response of suck it up or boys don't cry. That inherently just doesn't feel good and actually makes you feel worse, because children really need that parent to help them make sense of what they're feeling, and they need their parent to model how to soothe it, deal with it, talk to it, and process it. So a lot of men learn at a young age just not to say anything, to keep feelings inside, because the response when they did wasn't helpful. Those experiences carry over into adult relationships, and I find often that men are incredibly reluctant to ask for what they need, especially their emotional needs, from their partners. But if you don't know what you're feeling, or you're not in tune with your emotional inner world, then you don't know what you need. And if you don't know what you need, how can you ask for it in order to feel satisfied in a relationship? It leads to a lot of relationship problems. Rule number 3 is don't think pink. Masculinity requires you to actively reject anything feminine. This is a bizarre notion that is instilled in men somehow, and it states that it's not enough just to be okay being a man or a little boy, or stating that you like Transformers and soccer or art and Harry Potter. This rule states that on top of that, you actually have to go out of the way to reject anything perceived as feminine. And you can see this on the playground. At a certain age, boys just start playing with boys and not girls. And heaven forbid a little boy expresses any interest in some other kid's Barbie doll during recess, or wants to paint a unicorn with rainbows and flowers. If he were to do that, he will likely get very strong messages from peers and potentially adults about how inappropriate that is, and be reminded that pink is for girls and blue is for boys, or whatever nonsense it is. That reinforces and encourages that boy to reject the feminine and all things pink. Don't think pink is behind that rule that I definitely heard a lot of growing up, in which boys don't cry. Implicit in that rule is girls can cry and boys can't. So if a little boy does start to cry in the classroom, you can almost guarantee that other people will laugh at him or tease him or reject him for being perceived as feminine or emotional. So the message there is to reject anything feminine or associated with being feminine, which includes feelings. This rule is probably the most insidious, most subtle, and actually probably the most powerful rule that is ingrained in men as it relates to masculinity. It's particularly toxic for gay men because I think it's at the core of internalized homophobia, which leads to feelings of shame and inadequacy. So you can see now why therapy and talking about your feelings is going to be hard for some men who have been indoctrinated into this cult of traditional masculinity, because feelings and crying are all things that boys should never do. Don't think pink might mean that some men reject therapy altogether. Some reject it until things get so bad that they have to seek help. There's also a possibility that an emotionally sensitive, compassionate therapist could be seen as being too feminine or too feelings-oriented, and that therapist might get rejected too. So it's important for clinicians to be aware of this rule. When you're taught not to look inwards at your feelings, or you're encouraged to reject your emotional inner world because someone somewhere incorrectly said that it was feminine to do so, it instills a tendency for men to look outward for causes of suffering or discomfort. So I find that men tend to look outward for the source of their problems. It's my boss, it's my wife, it was the traffic, it's because I have the wrong job. They are less likely to be looking inwards for internal conflict or emotional issues as the primary reason for seeking help, and will easily dismiss psychological or emotional causes because the preference is to find the outside thing. And sometimes, of course, the boss is the problem and the wife is a pain, but there's always an internal emotional reaction to the problem that needs to be worked on and talked about. Rule number 4 is guns are great. This rule teaches boys that words don't solve problems, fists do. Aggression is strength, emotions are weakness, and this usually starts in the playground and follows men all the way through into adulthood. When boys and teens settle disputes with fists instead of words, it's often considered normal, natural. Sometimes it's encouraged or just given a pass. But all kids have aggressive impulses and anger. But in subtle and not so subtle ways, boys receive messaging that it's natural, acceptable, or normal to act out on those feelings. Toddlers act out on feelings. Not okay for grown-ups to do that. I think literally every male superhero movie or comic book reflects this, because for the most part, the male characters are all about using violence, not words, to seek revenge or get justice or make the world a better place. There's no superhero in the Marvel universe who is granted mystical powers after receiving a paper cut from a feelings wheel and granted the magical abilities of having challenging but very deep conversations over a cup of tea. All right, so those were the 4 rules of masculinity. I think it would be safe to assume that men relate to all 4 of them, but to varying degrees. And the extent to which anyone relates to the rules makes it harder to seek treatment. I'd also argue that the more someone identifies with these notions and rules, the more likely they will have other physical issues like high blood pressure, overworking, burnout, as well as depression, anxiety, and anger issues. So therapy for men is complicated. If you're considering starting therapy, it might be helpful to think about how and if these rules are influencing your decisions to pick up the phone or not. For therapists who work with men, these rules are always present, and I think it's important to have them in the back of your head when you start working with male-identified clients. When you think back to some of the earliest experiences children have when it comes to gender roles, toys, playing with others, you might agree that we are in part looking for feedback from other people about what is acceptable and what's not. It stands to reason then that men are constantly looking for signals in the world today that inform them how much they need to lean into the rules of masculinity, or if they're given permission to back away from them. So let's imagine Jimmy walking into his local bar on a Friday night on a first date with Jenny from the marketing department. He's immediately swamped with signals indicating that he needs to lean into the rules of masculinity quite heavily to avoid being shamed, humiliated, or rejected. So first of all, he walks into the bar and everyone around him is drinking beer. So don't order a pina colada, Jimmy. Don't think pink. There's probably an expectation for him to buy the first round or pay for dinner because he's got to bring home the bacon. On a first date, he's also not going to be very vulnerable or show too much affection because he's got to be the mountain. But if anyone looks at Jenny or tries to hit on her, then he'll toughen up because guns are great and men hit each other. In comparison, the situations in which a man is not required to follow the rules of masculinity are kind of few and far between. But there's one that you all know of, in which men can be incredibly expressive of their emotions and do not have to follow any of the rules of masculinity. And you've seen the toughest men who are totally identified with these rules of masculinity drop them, albeit temporarily. And that is when the local football, soccer, baseball, hockey team wins or loses a really important match. Right? In those moments, men have full permission to drop all of the rules, be as emotional as they want, expressive as they want. Grown men cry, weep, hug each other, yell at each other. You see it all. So for therapists, I think it is important to understand what signals we're giving off in our approach or demeanor or our appearance that indicates whether a male client has to lean into the rules of masculinity, which is not helpful for therapy, or if he can back away from them, which might be more conducive to getting the work done. So if your office is overwhelmingly pink, might be too much. It might trigger the rule of don't think pink to come on at full force. If we're pushing too soon, too fast for a male client to express their feelings or handing them the Kleenex, that might trigger someone to lean more into the rule of being the mountain and shut feelings off. So I get that we can't immediately redecorate our office, but to help men feel engaged in therapy, I think we can keep in mind that small talk is often helpful for men. It's less threatening than feelings talk. We can use humor to ease tension and show that we're not going to insist that somebody cries right off the bat. And if you're willing to do some titrated, thoughtful self-disclosure, I think that eases tension and makes things feel more natural. If you can angle chairs slightly so as not to be face-to-face, face-to-face or head-on with the client, that can be perceived as less aggressive and lower defensiveness. We can focus initially on the client's most presenting concern. I think it's been observed in the clinical world that men are much more likely to seek therapy when life is kind of on fire, when something really significant has happened. And when I think back to some of the men that I've worked with recently, it totally tracks: a breakup, loss of a loved one, partner threatening divorce, substance use, an affair, right? Things have got really tough for these gentlemen, and that is why they called. Now, to be fair, most people come to treatment when they're in need, when something big has happened. It's kind of what clinicians like myself have been trained for. It's what we're here to help with. But the difference I found to be true is some of the time for men is that they are much more focused on that specific issue, the fire that is burning closest to home, which makes total sense. But what it means is that a long-labored intake process over several weeks might mean that we're not properly attuning to their needs, and then we run the risk of clients leaving too soon. It's one of the reasons why when I start working with a male client, I'll ask, why now? Or what is going on now that you decided to call? Over time, I'm going to trust that I find out more about family of origin and other factors that are really important for me to understand and to help my client. But I have to be a bit patient and focus on what the perceived problem is or what's happening right now. I also think just acknowledging the courage it takes for men to seek help can be a great start to creating a therapeutic alliance too. And if nothing else, just a working knowledge of the 4 rules of masculinity can be enough. You don't even necessarily have to bring them up or discuss them. Just being curious in your thoughts and thinking about how they might be playing out for your client can be extraordinarily helpful. All right, hope that was helpful. Remember to hit subscribe, like, comment, share. I would love to hear from you if you have any questions.